Greetings. Welcome to the first conversation at noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. My name is Tammy Denise. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail as a way to recognize the Black and African Americans, as well as other marginalized populations' fight for freedom, equity, and inclusion in Connecticut, as well as mark sites that bear witness to the milestones in that quest. Today's conversation features Dr. Jason Mancini. Jason is the executive director of the Connecticut Humanities. Today, he will present Beyond Reservation, the hidden histories of Indian New England. He has more than 30 years experience working with the tribes here in southern New England. Jason is currently a Mellon Visiting Fellow in Slavery and Justice at Brown University. Jason will answer questions at the end of the presentation, so please put your questions or comments in the comments section. Thank you so very much, Dr. Mancini.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm so glad to be here. This presentation will be a window into some of the research that I've been doing for the past 30 or so years with the tribal communities of southern New England and some of the tribes from New Zealand, Alaska, and Hawaii. So I will draw some interesting connections and show some of the shared history of African and Native people in this region and their often intersecting and overlapping histories. So here we go. Can everybody see my screen? Hoping that's the case. Okay, so I've called this presentation Beyond Reservation, the Hidden Histories of Indian New England. And some of the things I'd like to accomplish today are threefold. First is moving beyond what we typically think we know about tribal histories in this region, which is connecting the 17th century Indian wars, the Pequot War and King Philip's War, in the 20th century casinos that everybody's familiar with today. And much of the history in between is a bit of a blank space on our history. And so I'll take you through that journey of both my research and those hidden histories. Part of that involves the impact of both dispossession or the loss of land and the erasure, the documentary erasure of Indigenous people, often called by communities pencil genocide. The things that are so important to this narrative in which I've been able to sort of connect over the centuries are ideas around a shared sense of homeland, identity, and kinship. These things persist today and will connect Indigenous people into the future. I'd like to orient people to the region's landscape, the cultural landscape here, so as to orient us to the area, the region that we live in, that we are familiar with, but that has largely been hidden from plain sight. And so most of my work, I'll use my cursor here to indicate, most of my work has been in southeastern Connecticut, here at Mashantucket and the Eastern Pequot community at Lantern Hill. And then I'll just sort of take you on a journey clockwise to the Mohegan tribe, the Niantic tribe in East Lyme, along the Connecticut River, the Wangunk and Tunxus in Middletown and Farmington, respectively, the Quinnipiac tribe in New Haven region, the Pagusset communities in southwestern Connecticut, and up the Housatonic to the present-day Scotticoke Indian tribe. Here in western Massachusetts, the Stockbridge community, Mohicans. In central Massachusetts, the Nipmuc tribes. In eastern Massachusetts, the Wampanoag tribes. And Rhode Island, the Narragansett and Eastern Niantic. For the purpose of this talk, I also want to talk about New York, particularly Long Island, Eastern Long Island, with the Montauk, the Shinnecock, and the Unkachog or Puspatuck. And for all intents and purposes, this was Indian country before the arrival of Europeans, and these are all indigenous homelands. And the map that I'm showing here represents about 9 million acres of land. And within 150 years of colonization, that land evaporated out of Indian possession and into European hands through various means, legal and illegal. And what I'd like to do is sort of share with you the story of how that happened and what the Indigenous responses were to that process, because it was quite devastating to the tribes here. Part of the backdrop of what's happening in the 18th century has to do a lot with the changing cultural landscape. Just to connect people to what's happening in the certainly the 17th century, but the outcome of the 18th century is this is the first time in human history in which people from 4 continents are coming into contact socially and sexually. And so new ideas of populations and people and movement are really recalibrating this region and the power systems that are here. Thinking about the enslaved people from Africa who are coming into the region's ports, especially Newport, into labor situations on plantations and on English farms across the region. That's continuing through most of the 18th century, actually all of the 18th century, where Indigenous people and African people are sharing more and more space. I'll circle back to that in a minute, but one of the things that's also happening throughout the 18th century is a series of colonial wars, from Queen Anne's War to King George's War to the French and Indian War to the American Revolution across the span of the 18th century. And in many of those conflicts, Indigenous men are serving and they're dying in disproportionately large numbers. And with that, what we start to see is the Indigenous male population decline, in steep decline, women and children struggling, and a growing African male population coming in. So we see, again, for the first time, these communities coming into closer alignment. And also with white people as well on the landscape. And what's happening as a result of some of these war deaths is that Indian women and children are becoming paupers in various communities and becoming more and more present on town records and town rolls for a variety of reasons, and soon end up in indentured servant or slave type situations. In addition to that, the image here on the upper left-hand slide begins to show the radical transformation of the physical landscape, the environment in southern New England, where expansive forests were quickly becoming carved up into fields, divided and allotted, and a entirely new property system emerging in southern New England and across the region, in which land is now owned to the exclusion of other people. And this is a system of land tenure that is unfamiliar and quite foreign to Indigenous ideas of communal land ownership. What I'd like to do is show you a series of 3 slides that begin to reshape our understanding of the populations in southern New England in the mid-18th century. I'll show you this one from 1756, one in 1762, and one in 1774, all at the beginning or end of a war, French and Indian War, and eventually the American Revolution. And this really begins to help us understand the ways in which Indian people are either enumerated or not, and also the growing population of African people that are showing up in the colony of Connecticut. So the left-hand slide is the Indigenous population. The right-hand image here is the African population. And you can see in 3 towns, Indians are being enumerated. In Lyme, Groton, and Stonington, those correlate closely with the 2 Pequot communities and the Niantic community. But as I pointed out earlier in the first map I showed, there are a number of Indian communities across Connecticut that are simply not being counted, including the Mohegan, the Wangunk, the Tungus, the Quinnipiac, Bagusset, and Schaghticoke, and a variety of other communities. So in this particular census, about 617 Indians are being counted. So we know there's a documentary discrepancy in this count. At the same time, the African population, you can see, has a growing presence across the region, and you can see clearly there is geographic overlap with those three towns as well, and that will only increase, especially as we move 6 years later towards the end of the French and Indian War, in which almost all the Indian communities that I outlined earlier are now being counted. The type of documentation is increasing. As I mentioned, pauperism is on the rise. The New England town system is developing. It's becoming more established. Clerks are creating records more effectively. Roads are developing. Churches are being developed in every town. So systems of European colonial structures are being developed and in place by this time period. And the presence of Indian people is becoming more routinely documented. And as you see, again, the Black presence in Connecticut is almost ubiquitous. For the Indians, there are about 940 in this count only 6 years later. And in this environment of dispossession, of pauperism, of indentured servitude and enslavement, we begin to see a really radical transformation of this population, so that by the eve of the American Revolution, we can see the way the Indian people are scattered across Connecticut. And I use that term scattered perhaps erroneously. There's very much a structure to this and a rhythm to this in which there is a greater visibility. And there are relationships between and among these communities. So here in 1774, there are about 1,360 Indians being counted in 49 Connecticut towns. So from 8 towns to 49 towns is quite an astonishing shift on the cultural landscape in Connecticut. And with the African population, you can see now the presence is now ubiquitous. So the opportunities, again, to interact socially and sexually are changing the types of interactions, the ways in which people of color are now being enumerated. But in these particular censuses, and this is really important, people are either being counted as Indian, Black, or Negro, or white. Those systems will change, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, in the ways in which the categories of race that are developing are also changing. But what I'd like to point out here very quickly is, as Indian people are pushing the boundaries of Connecticut, I want to make clear that they're also pushing the boundaries of the land, so that by the time we begin to understand that, looking at other kinds of records, we can begin to imagine that Indian people are now in ports and on vessels and in the ocean. And so I'd like to just highlight a couple of early Atlantic world experiences of some Indian men from southeastern Connecticut, or eastern Connecticut anyway. The first being George Job, who sailed on the brigantine London in 1732 and 1733. And he documents this voyage in a series of court records in New London, in which he sued the captain of this vessel for withholding his wages for a 14-month voyage. And you can imagine being pretty upset at not getting paid for 14 months of work. So we know about this because the captain of the ship is sued. And very interestingly, George Job wins this case. We tend to think the Indians don't win anything anywhere, but there are these moments in time where we can see systems of with unequal power are being adjudicated in a way that is sometimes favorable to individuals or communities of color. So George Jobe was compensated for this. And what I'd like to do is just point out this voyage. We can begin to imagine where in the world they're going. This is more or less a crude polygon, but I like to imagine this more, if I were to redraw it today, thinking about this more as an oval or a circle following the ocean currents. And that will become more and more relevant later in this presentation. Second individual here I'd like to talk about is Tantapanant, or Philip. And he was a young boy sailing on the sloop Elizabeth just a year or two later from Rocky Hill along the Connecticut River to the mouth of the Connecticut River and then into the Caribbean. These are not atypical. These voyages were happening all the time in the Caribbean trade and the trade to Europe as Atlantic world commerce is really developing in earnest. Tantapanant, and it's important to point out, has an alias. And these aliases are often important, both in port and at sea, in which people can use them strategically to elude authorities in different situations. But Tantapanant put himself in a situation between two masters, a master on the land and a master at sea, and created a situation in which he wanted to go to sea, where he had more freedom, and he assured his master on land that he could make more money. This ended up precipitating a fight between his two masters, and Tantapanant ultimately got his way and was able to go to sea. So these are the ways in which indigenous people, and broadly speaking, people of color, are learning to maneuver this European colonial structure, the system, these legal codes that are increasingly constricting. And these, we'll start to see this a little bit more, and we'll start to see the ways in which these elaborate over time. But this is just a couple of examples from early Connecticut court records that show us how Native people are maneuvering in these situations. As we move through the 18th century, these situations of servitude or enslavement or harsh labor arrangements begin to show up more and more in newspaper advertisements through runaway advertisements. And so this is sort of a book compiling a series of these called Runaways, Deserters, and Notorious Villains. I've been through a lot of these accounts for Connecticut, for Rhode Island, for Massachusetts. And what we start to see is just increasing numbers across the 18th century. People are getting out of bad situations. So they're either runaways from enslaved situations or indentures, deserters from the military, or notorious villains, which is code for piracy. And this image is of a couple of Wampanoag whalers much later, but just to point out that these depictions of indigenous people, people of color, in these runaway advertisements are often quite detailed. And this is in an era before photographs or images are readily available. So they're often incredibly descriptive, indicating an individual's name, their height, their complexion, what they were last seen wearing, any special talents they might have, or distinguishing marks, tattoos, a missing digit, a scar, something like that. And at the end of many of these runaway advertisements is a warning to masters of vessels not to harbor, conceal these individuals under the strictest penalty of law. So what this says to me is that when given an opportunity to escape a bad situation, these individuals are moving towards the region's ports, getting on vessels, and going to sea. And we see individuals, not just individuals, we see this often in groups of people, 2 to 6 or 7 people sometimes, and again, volume. To the point where we have to start wondering, what about, are there social networks? Are there larger groups of people doing this together? Are these a group of individuals, or is there something else that's more cohesive in this work? So I started looking for this in various record groups and noticed that one of the areas in which I first noticed this group cohesion was with shipbuilding. And this is an image of the Continental Frigate Confederacy that was built in 1778 and 1779 along the Thames River. In particular, its location directly across the river from the Mohegan Reservation in Montville. In the Confederacy, I was able to track down its construction records in Philadelphia, and there were over a dozen Indian men involved in the construction of this vessel, mostly as ship's riggers. They were involved in various capacities, but ship's riggers really caught my attention because by that time, these were the men that were perhaps most important to the vessel. These were the engineers. They were the ones that did all the ropes, the blocks, the tackle, the sails. They knew more than anything. And they were, you can see these masts are scary high. And these men were up there putting the ship together. To me, they're the Mohawk ironworkers of their day, doing some of the most dangerous work. And when the ship was completed, many of these same men sailed on board, not just as stewards or boys or cooks, but as ordinary seamen, able-bodied seamen, Marines, in various capacities. So very much a merit-based system at sea, providing opportunity to Indians and other men of color. And importantly, I want to call attention to the fact that Mohegans weren't just the only Indian people on this vessel. There were also Pequots and Nipmucks. And if you start looking at various other vessels during this time, whether military or commercial, the same thing is happening. So we start to see this sort of intercultural space in which Indigenous people are certainly aggregating, but they're connecting communities across space and time. So now we have the sort of internal connections and the beginnings of a social network, to the point where we begin to see, or I begin to see anyway, that there are so many Indigenous men participating in maritime economies that white overseers who are going to the reservations across the region are beginning to notice their absence. In this example, a white overseer went to Mohegan and said, "The young men go to sea and die. The only people here are old women, crippled men, and children." Similar observations are being made across the region. And when we start to probe this a little bit more, we can go to the customs districts in New London for some amazing record groups, and including Seamen's Protection Certificates and surrendered crew lists. This is an image of the customs houses built in 1833, but these customs records begin in the late 1790s by an act of Congress, certainly in the era in which the British Royal Navy is impressing American seamen. So they create an act for the protection of American sailors. So there's a more systematic documentation of all sailors, but in particular, for the purposes of this study, sailors of color. And of the 6,000 or so mariners that I've documented in the New London Customs District, about a third of them are people of color. And this is the kind of information that emerges in these records. And the records are maintained in alphabetical lists. What you see here is a database that my interns and I created, just to give you a snapshot of what this looks like. And in the left-hand column, you can see the dates in which the documents are initiated. This second column is a Seamen's Protection Certificate number, which is in essence a passport that provides a great deal of information. Again, kind of like those runaway advertisements, all of the details that we would have if absent any pictures or available images. Their name, and here I can almost instantly call out Indigenous people like the Ashbows. It's a very common Mohegan name. Down here are the Aarons, here and here. Actually, it's the same person showing up twice, but Reuben Aaron as well. This is a common Pequot name. Ages, you can see the age range from 11 to 47 here. Sometimes that goes either way, a little bit more. Their height, their complexion, Black, Indian, mulatto, Negro, colored. There are a constellation of labels that emerge here during this time, about 12 that I've seen. And that is part of that, that intersection in the ways of race across those, across the 18th century as people are coming together. European record keepers don't quite know what to do with this, especially as Indians have particular sets of rights and Africans have none. And there are different ways of keeping populations separate, but sometimes that's hard to avoid. And this is where we begin to see that nuance. Some of those distinguishing characteristics, pockmarks, scars, additional details on complexion, and then birthplace. We can do some interesting exercises to see when they were born and where their parents lived when they were born, and look at some of the cultural geography through this as well. I just want to turn your attention back to the Seaman's Protection Certificate number, because there's a wide range here from 8 to 5,800 just on this sheet alone. And as I mentioned, this is just alphabetical list A, and then there's one for every letter of the alphabet. But when we sort of aggregate all of that data into a database and reshuffle, a new set of information emerges. And new stories emerge as well. So if we reorder those, we can see here Seaman's Protection Certificate number 309 and 310, two brothers, Peter and Benjamin George, who are both Indians from the town of Groton. Groton happens to be the place where the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation is during that time, before Ledyard was carved out of it. But these two brothers have often been criticized as not being Pequot. But if we cross-reference these documents with overseers' records and Indian papers documents, these men are actually signing as chiefs and counselors of the Pequot tribe and acknowledged by the state at the same time. If we go a little bit down the list here, we have 3 Indian men, all from Stonington. What's important here is that not a single one of these men ever shows up in tribal records. And that is true for about 90% of the people labeled Indian, which is a testament to those census records that show the movement away from the reservations. There's simply no opportunities on the reservations for most of the Indian population. So new rules around citizenship emerge. I didn't touch on that earlier, but Indians are being excluded from their own reservations, but their lives are found elsewhere in surrounding towns and in the ports across the region. If we look here, we have 3 men, again labeled Indian, almost sequential, from different towns across the region. And the only person here in tribal records is Augustus Harry, who's Narragansett. The other men are becoming they are parts of other types of communities that I'll share with you in just a little bit. And we can see this broader, what I call ethno-fraternities here, as we have people being labeled Negro and Indian from across the region and beyond, all sequential. They're all going to port at the same time, getting sequential numbers. And the same here with this group in purple, and so on. This becomes a really interesting way of beginning to look at how Indian people are recalibrating their relationship, not only to one another, but to the land and beyond. So what exactly is happening here as these men are creating new kinds of ethnic groups at sea? We can start to look at this on a vessel-specific level. For example, here's a crew list for the ship Connecticut, and there are 4 men on this voyage, including Charles Brayton here, who's Pequot. I know this is going to be really hard for you to see. Benjamin Uncas, I'm sure many of you recognize that name, as Mohegan. Joseph Fagans, who is also Pequot, and Alicia Apes, who is of Indian descent, born and raised on the Pequot Reservation in Groton. I'll come back to him in a little bit. But what do we start to do with this? This ship Connecticut is on up here. This says ship Connecticut, and it's bound to this on a whaling voyage to the Atlantic Ocean. So what does that mean? It's a pretty big place, and it's hard to decipher where that might be. But when we have the logbooks, and this logbook is part of the New London County Historical Society's collections, this provides not just detail every day on weather and the status of the ship, but whales sighted, whales harvested, and so on. Perhaps one of the more important pieces of data here is right here, latitude and longitude. And with that is global positioning. And that allows us to do something really interesting, and that is beginning to map these voyages in systems like Google Earth. This is a compilation of 4 whaling voyages, 3 of which took place in the 1830s and 1 in the 1860s, all with groups of Native men on board. But you can begin to see the global space in which these men partake, where they're seeing each other all around the world. This is just a snapshot of a couple of years. And you can see a lot of activity off the Brazil banks and in the South Atlantic Ocean. There's a whaling station here on this little tiny volcanic island called Tristan da Cunha, which is a supply station. And so these become the intersecting spaces in which Indigenous people are seeing each other, sharing news, connecting with other Indigenous people from around the world, people from Africa, Cape Verde Islands, South America, and so on. These are a new constellation of relationships, and beyond that, we start to see, let me just go back here for a minute. We start to see the ways that people are leaving their homelands for other places. Alicia Apes, for example, ends up in New Zealand, marries into the Maori community there. All of his descendants are there today. Others end up in Hawaii, in Alaska, and in ports around the world. In the same way, many of these men from other places are coming back to New England and marrying into the tribal communities here. And if you visit those communities, or if you know anything about their particular histories, you know how nuanced and complicated they are, and how multi-ethnic the community, or multi-ethnic ancestries these communities have. Shifting gears, and I'm mindful of time, and I want to give about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I just want to touch on the impact of these opportunities of the men at sea, because it's producing a new kind of economy for them to earn money, to bring resources back home. And this translates back to the land in which tribal reservations are being dispossessed, tribal people are being forced away. But we start to see land ownership increasing, private land ownership, I should say, increasing across the 18th and 19th centuries. And so this image here shows some initial private land ownership in the 1720s, increasing to about the era of the American Revolution. Ownership persisting, but the environment becomes more hostile to people of color owning private land. So that by the era of the Civil War, the antebellum era, we start to see almost a complete absence of people of color owning land in rural Connecticut. And that correlates with the increasing urbanization of Indigenous people and African-American people in communities. And there are very particular examples I can point at in which we see this in Bridgeport, in Boston, Hartford, New Haven, and so on. These patterns can be mapped onto actual communities. The ways in which people, Indian people and people of color are acquiring land is often very strategic. In these two examples, both from Black Point in East Lyme, this is the Niantic Reservation on Niantic Bay. This is a 300-acre reservation. Adjacent to the north side, where there were several instances of white encroachment and land theft, Indian men acquired land privately to prevent that type of encroachment as they own land in the English manner. Similar interactions are happening here on the Eastern Pequot Reservation in North Stonington. Again, another 300-acre or so reservation, but a series of land acquisitions to the north. And again, strategically placed to prevent grazing animals and timber theft and other forms of encroachment by neighboring white people onto tribal lands. These are constant issues for the tribal community. We see their ongoing petitions for relief to the state legislature in Connecticut across the 19th century and beyond, actually into the 20th century as well. Additional lands are being acquired elsewhere, sort of new communities and old places. These are not traditional reservation places, but they are places where Indian communities have persisted for long periods of time. In the early 18th century, a group of Indians called the Patchogue Indians show up here. I want to point out that the scale on these maps is very different. This patch right here is about 100 acres, and this equals probably all these three parcels. So that's a little bit off. But a whole series of property owners here, about half a dozen different Indian families own land up here in the town of Griswold, Connecticut. And this is a series of Indian families in Groton, Connecticut by the Groton Reservoir or Poheganet area. These are being acquired, maintained, and passed on across generations. So ownership is more comfortable. People are able to manage it rather than become indebted and be forced to sell. And these are strategic ways in which Indian people and broadly people of color are holding onto land. I want to take the opportunity here to mention too, in many of these land acquisitions privately, it's Indian women purchasing the land, sometimes because they have enslaved husbands. And they are the ones that are able to acquire the land. And this is very different from their white counterparts. And it shows a way in which Indian women are connecting communities to land. This is something that does not go away. Women have a particularly important place in tribal communities, and especially in relation to land tenure, especially when Indian men are often so often away at sea. So the ways in which people are staying connected across the region are manifold. And I just want to share a couple of examples here. One, through basket making. This is something that Indian women are commonly doing. This is an example. The image on the right is the way in which many historical accounts talk about how baskets are nested up within each other and carried by women that hides them from sight. And they're selling them to all of the region's farms, and they show up a lot in antique collections. They're surely in museums, but these are very important part of a local economy for Indigenous people, in which the black ash is harvested, woven into baskets, stamped or painted. A particular example from Mashantucket by an Indian woman named Anne Wampy. You can see here's the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation here. There are historic accounts that talk about her selling her baskets in Preston City, in Jewett City, and Griswold. I overlaid the description of her movement with census records from the 1850s, and you can see a number of Pequot families that are out in these towns. That is, she is almost more than likely visiting while she's gone for weeks at a time. There's another family at Mashantucket that's making baskets and then make their travels to New London. father and daughter, who were checking on 4 of the boys in the family who were all on whale ships during that time. So this is how people are sharing news of one another and their families and staying connected. But this is just a very local geography. These connections are happening across the region, and they're often more expansive across tribal territories and homelands. I'll just touch quickly on the matters of race, just to show you how inconsistent labels can be. This is one individual. This is Amasa Lawrence. This is his Civil War carte de visite. In his Civil War uniform, he's Mashantucket Pequot. On the back of this card, he is labeled Chief of the Pequots. And throughout his life, he's documented on the reservation and in various state, town, and federal documents. And he's listed in all of these different ways, from dark to mixed Negro and white, Indian, Indian again, free colored person, Indian black, Indian doctor. He was a very important medicine person in the region. He was also so important in the region that he was noted in his grandson's obituary in 1934 in the town of Westerly, Rhode Island. So this is one person. We see a picture of him, and you can see the many different ways he's labeled. This is how Indian people and people of color broadly are being categorized and misunderstood across time, where every time he shows up in records, he self-identifies as Pequot. And this is where there's clearly very different ideas of who is and who isn't Indian. So I talked earlier about the economies of Indian people and maritime labor. By the 1870s, that economy vanishes in New England anyway. And the center of gravity of the whale fishery shifts from the northeastern ports of New Bedford and New London and Sag Harbor to San Francisco and Hawaii. And so I struggled to locate all of those hundreds and hundreds of Indian men, because there are exactly 2 Indians listed on the 1870 federal census. But if we go just over the border to Rhode Island, Westerly, Rhode Island, the granite industry and the service industry are taking off. And all of a sudden, this is where the Indians are. And importantly, Westerly's north end, which is known in the National Register for Historic Places as the Italian North End for an Italian community, often erases the presence of Indian people. When I started going through oral histories of tribal elders, what I realized was that in historical documents, what I realized is there is a significant population of Indian people from across the region relocating to Westerly. And in oral histories, the Indian elders would talk about how the Italians owned the land and built the houses, but they rented to the Indians. And what I did was I start to map neighborhoods of Indian people over time. And at the center of this neighborhood, I'm sorry, one of my images is missing here, but at the center of this neighborhood was a church built in the 1870s, now known as the Pleasant Street Baptist Church, but founded in 1874 as the Advent Christian Colored Church, but known colloquially as the Indian Church. And it was chartered by 3 Narragansett tribal members. And this was one of the ministers, Leroy Perry, in the 1920s. So important continuity across time. It's still known today as the Indian Church, though it has more of a Black history connected with it now. But in that neighborhood was chartered in 1931 the American Indian Federation for education and legal recourse against stolen lands. You can see here through the powwows and socials that it holds. This became the centerpiece of civic education and engagement for tribal people across the region. And I do mean that. There are people, 200 members of this organization across dozens of tribes across the country. And they were taking on legal matters with the federal government during this time. Local publications document this, including the Narragansett Dawn in the 1930s. And of course, one of the local heroes that's still celebrated today is a famous marathon runner, Tarzan Brown, who won the 1936 and 1939 Boston Marathon. And you can see here his Westerly, Rhode Island shirt. He's still a hometown hero. The communities persist. They're stronger than ever. From the American Indian Federation became the National Chicago Indian Conference, of which there's continuity through that, to the American Indian movement of the 1970s, and then the federal recognition era of the 1980s, 90s, and beyond. So I will leave it here, and happy to take any questions if I can find. Oh, I think I might have to stop my screen share.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Mancini. You do have some questions in the comment box. The first one is from Moo Dog Press. Is there a comprehensive listing, compilation of museums and sites in the region open to the public to visit? And then they also would like to know if there are any related books that could be shared.
There are a lot of resources. I would say, for starters, to visit places. The two most significant places I would suggest to start with the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. It's the world's largest tribal museum with 90,000 square feet of exhibits. It's an amazing place to visit. If you've not been, it's worth it. I spent most of my career there. It's considered one of the best attractions in Connecticut. I would also suggest the Tantaquidgeon Indian Museum at Mohegan. It's the oldest tribal museum in the country, built in 1931 by John Tantaquidgeon and his children, Harold and Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who are tribal knowledge keepers and still maintained and operated by the Mohegan tribe today. In terms of resources, there's some new content on Connecticut Humanities site, teachitct.org. And if you follow the links presented there, there's some great resources. And then also I co-founded an Indigenous educational organization called Agamowt, AKOMAWT. And if you go to agamowt.org, there are an expansive list of books and resources that we suggest you start with. They're Indigenous sourced and cover the most recent materials available.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mariana Garcia. She's like, hello, Jason, our wonderful presentation. Could you talk a little bit about Indigenous people participating in elections in Connecticut and how that has evolved?
Well, Indigenous people participate, they have multiple citizenships to their tribe. So they certainly vote in their own tribal elections, to which they're accountable. But they participate in state and federal elections as well. So their citizenships, plural, enable them to participate more fully in our systems of governance.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question from Aaron Good. Has there been any recent research or advances in scholarship related to the Quinnipiac Reservation on the east shore of New Haven Harbor?
Probably the most comprehensive book I'm familiar with on the Quinnipiac was written by John Menta, Quinnipiac Tribal History. I don't remember the exact title of the book, but that's the author. I know Quinnipiac University is beginning to engage this history a little bit more, as is Yale. Of course, both of those universities are situated within Quinnipiac homelands, and we are starting to see ways that universities and colleges across Connecticut and the region, in the country for that matter, are engaging the homelands in which they're situated.
Thank you. Next question comes from Kelvin Williams. What is the relationship of the Indian and Black communities today?
That's an interesting question, and there are probably there's a range of answers. What I'd like to say, because I think it's an interesting historical piece that I didn't get to speak about, is in the 1820s and 1830s, there's some really interesting intersections with African American and Native American civil rights movements, certainly intersecting with abolitionism during that time. And while we have people like William Lloyd Garrison, who's putting forth the Liberator, there are also Black newspapers, Black edited and contributed newspapers like Freedom's Journal, that are really important for carrying the message of freedom and liberty. At the same time, there are people like William Apes, who's he's a Pequot Indian and the first American Indian autobiographer, who's writing for the Liberator and participating in civil rights discourses during that time, especially as we see the era of Indian removal shaping the 1830s. So there's a lot going on. And we often think about Indian civil rights and African civil rights as separate realities. But I think it's important to recognize a tremendous amount of overlap. And that's why I'm really excited about the work of Connecticut's Freedom Trail in the committee work, because those are stories that are shared stories. The fight for freedom and justice and liberty is something that belongs to everybody. And Native American people, the tribal people in Connecticut and beyond, have often been overlooked in that narrative. And I think what we see historically is that they were often in discourse with one another, and they're still in discourse today. So the relationship is still there. And I think we sometimes forget how aligned it has been, or perhaps could be.
Thank you very much.
I didn't mean to dodge that entirely, but I think, there are a lot of overlaps, and we're seeing those alignments today, especially with a lot of the civil rights movements now.
No dodgement at all. I think you answered it. Thank you very much. The next question comes from Shell Ferran. Mason Monument in Mystic, 1889. The Battle of Mystic was about 250 years prior. Why erected then? Was it nationalism, reaction to increased private land ownership maybe, or opposition to peace conventions?
I think at that time, so the Mason statue was erected in 1889. This was really within a couple of years of the last of the Indian Wars. So the Lakota at Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee Massacre had just taken place. That's considered the end of the Indian Wars. And so this was a moment, what's interesting is the Pequot War was the first of the Indian Wars. And I think that this kind of bookended the colonial enterprise in the United States. And I think that was a way to really mark that moment in time to under this sort of settler-colonial framework of possession, ownership, and the elimination of internal conflict, if you will, that was sort of settled at that point. And I think that was Connecticut putting their own mark on that.
Okay. We have time for maybe one more question or comment. If anyone wishes to ask, please put it into the chat box. And while we're waiting for maybe one more question, we have a brief survey that we would love for you to complete, because we would love to hear your thoughts on today's program. And just to give you a little more information about the Freedom Trail, or the public talks, I should say, going forward, each fourth Tuesday is when we will have conversations at noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. And we are hoping that you will join us then as well. The next one will be February 22nd, right here at noon. So you and whomever you may know would be interested, please invite them to come and join us. And also, we have the Connecticut History Day, where we have a need for judges. So if you are interested in being a judge and want to sign up, please go to historydayct.org. Well, there are no other questions or comments. I would like to say thank you so very much, Dr. Jason Mancini, for being our very first conversation at noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Hope you'll come back and join us again. And thank you, our listening audience. I am Tammy Denise, and until next time.
Thank you, Tammy.